Hello everyone, we've now reached our third video on our series on Shakespearean sonnets, and here we're going to analyze sonnet 116 together. I've placed it on the next slide. I'm going to read through it once. You can feel free to listen to that, or if you have a copy and you'd like to read along on your own at home, you can go ahead and do that as well. Sonnet 116 by William Shakespeare. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no, it is an ever fixed mark, that looks on tempests and is never shaken. It is the star to every wandering bark, whose worth's unknown, although his height be taken. Love's not time's fool, though rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come. Love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out, even to the edge of doom. If this be error, and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved. So I know then the first thing I need to do is, again, to break these down into their separate stanzas to figure out what central theme is Shakespeare getting at. And the first thing I do is look at that first stanza, and I'm going to ask myself, what overall topic do I believe Shakespeare is discussing? And based on his repetition and other literary devices we'll discuss shortly, we can clearly identify that he's describing what love is not. This is going to be part of the central idea he's trying to drive home. So we know the theme is going to revolve around love. But then I look at the next stanza and I need to figure out, okay, I know what he is discussing, but how is Shakespeare discussing it? And the first way in which Shakespeare is going to help us determine what love is not is by telling us what love is. And we're going to notice as we begin to analyze that he's going to make use of metaphor to help us better understand what he believes this true love is. And then we turn to our third stanza. And this is where we begin to see that twist or complexity appear in terms of what Shakespeare is discussing. And here, similar actually in fact to Sonnet 18, we see the fact that there's this eternal quality to the nature of love, and the literary device that Shakespeare will use to drive this point home is personification. Then I turn to my last stanza, that final couplet, and I'm going to ask myself, what sort of final comment is Shakespeare saying about this quality of true love? And I realize that what he does is to make this definition of love. Now that I've identified then what I believe this central theme to be, that's going to revolve around the nature of true love, and that it doesn't seek to alter or to change, I'm going to take a look at that first stanza and see what type of evidence exists, and does that evidence support my theme, or maybe do I need to move in a different direction or clarify what I mean. I'm going to look at the first line here, and I want to draw your attention to some examples of sound devices that we see going on here. So for example, the first two circles on the left that I've made for you, let me not. So here we have an example of consonants. So I have that repetition of the consonant sound with the letter T that's occurring at the end of a set of words that occur in quick succession after one another. But additionally, I also have alliteration, which is similar to consonants in that you have this repetition of sound, but rather than occurring in the middle or the end of the word, I have it in the very beginning, right? So this marriage of true minds. And this is helpful insofar as it creates this serene and peaceful mood. I don't feel anxious by the diction that the poet is using. And then additionally, I also need to recognize the fact that he is defining from the very beginning what type of love he's discussing. And he's talking about this love that is honest and pure and devoted. And also make sure that you make note of the fact that Shakespeare uses the word marriage. And this is going to be important, particularly in this first stanza, because it's going to allude to something that we see continued in the second verse, which I'm going to get to in a moment. But before I do that, I want to again draw your attention to meter. So we're not forgetting that Shakespeare is making use of iambic pentameter, which I've done for you here in the second verse. And this again helps to create that serene mood that's already been established. So jumping back to the allusion that I referenced a moment ago, we have this word impediments. And this is particularly important because, as you'll see in the box to the right, this word impediment is used on purpose, and it's an allusion to marriage vows taken from Shakespeare's time in England, and simply saying that when we discuss this type of love, it's a love that forms a vow or a bond. So it's not a love that's trivial or contrite. It's a love that is true and lasting. It's covenantal. And also drawing your attention here to the use of repetition. Love is not love. So Shakespeare here, again, he's trying to draw your attention to the central topic that he's discussing. And again, this would be evidence for why I believe that Shakespeare is talking about love. And this allusion to marriage vows being evidence to why I believe Shakespeare is talking about love that's more deep in terms of its commitment. And continuing to the rest of the stanza. Again, I'm going to see that he makes use of something called parallelism. And this is a literary device that is meant to persuade the audience. Okay, so remember, we've already talked about one type of persuasive technique, being rhetorical questions. And now here we see another. So Shakespeare is trying to persuade or convince the audience that this type of love he's discussing, it does not change when it finds change in the subject of its love or things capable of being changed. It accepts the person for who they are. And we call this parallelism because we have words contained in this phrase that mimic or parallel one another. We see the same thing being used in the final verse here, or bends with the remover to remove. Again, trying to get us to understand the fact that just as it does not change when it sees that change is possible, it also does not go out of its way to enact that change, to remove things about the lover. Jumping then to my next stanza here, I'm going more into the not what is being discussed, but how it's being discussed. And this is where I begin that extended metaphor that I was discussing a few slides ago. And the metaphor is going to begin by describing this type of love as an ever-fixed mark. And here we need to better understand the language that Shakespeare is using because it's very particular to his time. So mark here not meaning a mark that you would have on a graded paper, for example, but a mark meaning a sea mark, like a beacon or a lighthouse. And a lighthouse would be used to help prevent ships from going too close to the shore and crashing in the midst of poor weather, where they're unable to see. So the first type of quality that Shakespeare is giving this type of love is that it's one that seeks to protect, that even in times of danger or storms, it's not something that will be susceptible, we can say, right, to danger. So yes, danger will exist, but it will never succumb to it. And this metaphor continues in the next verse, right, that looks on tempests and is never shaken. And here we have this imagery of this storm or the sea continuing. So tempest in Shakespeare's time being in two senses used here. So one in the sense that it's a storm, but also in this sense of the ability of someone from outside of this love to tempt it, to pull it away from its rightful place. And here Shakespeare is claiming that this type of love, this true love, never gives in to the storm. And if you're paying close attention, you're going to notice that up until this point, Shakespeare is describing true love in very idealistic terms. And one of the things that we should feel free to do as readers, always, not just in poetry, but in any type of literature, is to question whether or not we are persuaded by the speaker, whether or not we really believe them. So this type of love that he is describing, do we think it actually exists? Because this is what Shakespeare is going to try to convince us of, that in fact it does exist. So I'm looking then to my third verse, and I see this metaphor continuing, but now it's not that love is just being compared to a sea mark or something that is unable to be tempted by storms, but also this idea of a star that is a guide. And we need to make sure that we understand, again, Shakespeare's language, because unless we understand what he is discussing, what he's alluding to, we're not really going to understand the metaphor being made. Here in verse 3, when Shakespeare says star, he's specifically referring to the northern star, or the Polaris. Okay? And this is important because in keeping with this imagery of the sea, we have this use of wandering bark, and bark meaning a ship. So if you are familiar with nautical terms or navigation on the sea, one of the things that you could always count on as someone who was a sailor is the fact that if you are lost, you can always wait for the northern star. It will point to true north, and you can use it as a way to guide you back. So Shakespeare is saying here that this true love is a guide for those who are lost. So again, this quality of love being able to save. And then finally, I go to my last verse, and I'm going to continue to see this metaphor being extended. And when he is discussing this his here, although his height be taken, I'm understanding then that he's referring to this northern star. So although I can measure the star, right? Scientifically, I know where it is in the sky. The fact that its worth is unknown is important, right? So just as I can see love through action, perhaps, or through words that are said, this type of true love, I'm really not going to be able to fully comprehend its worth. It's far too great a thing to be measured in that sense. Now I come to my third stanza, and here I'm going to have this twist, and Shakespeare's going to begin to discuss this true love in terms of its eternal qualities. And I'm going to see that through the use of personification. So here Shakespeare is personifying not just love, but time. And he's saying this, that love, this true love, is not bound to the weathers of time. So although time has the power to take away our youth, represented by that imagery of the rosy lips and cheeks, ultimately, right, when we come to verse 2, we begin to see that it's not able to be overcome by death. We understand that he's speaking about death here, one, by the use of the word here, sickle. So sickle would have been a common symbol for death, or the grim reaper. So this means that love, in the sense of its eternal quality, is not under the pressures of time. And as we know, with time, as we get older, we become closer to death. So this is what he's saying here. And then we have our third verse, okay? And here he says, love alters not with its brief hours and weeks. So again, although there is a physical change that exists, right? Though those rosy lips and cheeks, those signs of youth fade, right? This eternal quality of love still exists, right? It doesn't change. And then finally, I see that Shakespeare again is using very idyllic imagery to quantify or to explain this type of love that he's painting for me. So he says that it bears it out. It handles and goes through, weathers everything, even to the edge of doom. So no matter what this type of love faces, no matter what the dangers are, it will never fade. So again, I need to put on my skeptic hat a little bit and look within myself and see, do I really believe what Shakespeare is saying, right? So it's one thing to analyze on a comprehension level, what is he saying? But then on a more evaluation level, do I believe or buy into what he's trying to argue? And then finally, I come to my couplet. And here we're going to see the final response that Shakespeare's making in terms of this argument. And here we see that it ends in a similar manner to how he begins, right? So this imagery of making a vow or a promise. So here he's saying that if this be error, and upon me proved, and this referring to his argument. So if my idea of love, the way that I've described it, turns out to be wrong, and there's proof for this, he then goes on to say that I have never written, right? Meaning that everything that I have committed my life to is for nothing, and by extension, no man has ever loved. And this is a literary device that we call hyperbole. This will be a new one, I think, for some of you if you haven't heard of it before. And hyperbole is simply an exaggeration of what I'm saying. So here, his exaggeration is that if my definition of love is proven to be wrong, then not only have I never written anything, everything that I've done has been for nothing. No man in the history of time has ever truly loved. So now I'm going to want to piece all of this together. And I'm going to begin with looking at that original theme that I identified. And my central theme was this idea of the perfect nature of true love. That not only does it not seek to change the beloved, but that it's not susceptible to time in terms of its lasting quality. So physically, the relationship might change in terms of looks, right? The youth fading away. But that eternal quality to love, that lasting emotional connection won't. And here I begin to question, as I analyze what Shakespeare says, do I think perhaps he's being too idealistic? Do I think what he is describing really is not possible? And now that I've identified this theme, I'm going to go and look at that evidence again and ask myself, truly, does the evidence that I have found support my theme? Again, I want to be careful not to do this the other way around, okay? So it's not that I'm identifying a theme and then I'm looking at the verses to try to make things fit, right? I make up, right? Or put words into Shakespeare's mouth to support my argument, okay? So I'm looking at this and I know that Shakespeare makes use of metaphor and personification throughout this particular sonnet. And he does so to help me better understand what love is and what it's capable of, the fact that it has this lasting and guiding quality. And then I finally look to my couplet, because this is going to drive home Shakespeare's point, this declaration that he is making, that if his argument turns out to be incorrect, that essentially everything he has written has been a lie, a falsehood, and that no one has ever loved. And this is going to be his last attempt to persuade me as his reader, do I believe him or not? And that would be something interesting too in terms of an essay, right? So having a prompt of analyzing what theme Shakespeare is saying and whether or not I really buy into that theme. Okay, that's it for our analysis of Sonnet 116. So what I would like you to do in terms of practice on your own is I'd like you to read Sonnet 138. And I've included it here for you on the right. And this is going to be a shift away from the other sonnets that we've been reading because, as you'll notice, based on its numbering, number 138, this falls firmly into the category of sonnets dedicated to the dark lover, or Shakespeare's mysterious mistress. So I'd like you to read through that and simply practice what we've been doing together. So break it down into its stanzas. Figure out what each stanza is telling me, what theme do I see emerging, and then go back through and analyze and see what sort of evidence do I find, and what does that evidence tell me? Does it support my theme or not? Okay, that's it for this video. In the next video, video number 4, we'll begin by going over the solution to Sonnet 138. So please make sure you've done that at home on your own first. And then I'll make a video where I analyze it with you so you can check and make sure, did you identify the same or similar theme that I did, and what sort of evidence were you able to grab at. And then the last thing that we'll do is look at essay writing. So looking at a sample prompt that you would use for 138, Sonnet 138, and working on practicing our outlining. Okay, so as you'll see on the meme to the right, one does not simply have a successful essay without an outline. So I know a lot of you are not fans of an outline, but because we're discussing analysis in terms of poetry and it's something new for a majority of the class, I'm going to stress that we must have an outline when we begin this first essay, okay? Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.